Grace and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Jerusalem, who killed the prophet sent to her, who stoned those who call her to repentance. When I was a kid, you're not supposed to chuckle. A long time ago, growing up in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota, of course, everywhere in North Dakota is nowhere. There were a couple of events as a farm kid that I always looked forward to, which will in some ways demonstrate the poverty of my upbringing. One was in the spring of the year when the little chickens arrived. They came in the mail in a box. Yeah, and they were chirping up a storm. And you would open the box and there those little yellow, cuddly little chickens would be. Now there was always a couple that had failed to actually make the entire journey. They would be discarded and we would be busy trying to fatten these little things up so that they could take their place with the rest of the chickens. And I always thought about that. Did some of the older chickens look at the little ones that just arrived and said, replacements? Now, as the youngest of the family and the one obviously most picked on, my daily duty was to collect the eggs. You learn something real quickly in that endeavor. Most of the chickens were gracious enough to leave the little nesting cubicles that were along one of the walls so that you could just pick the eggs up, but some would be sitting there, and so I would stick my hand in underneath only to be pecked. Which brings me to my second favorite event of the year when it came to chickens: the fall. When I was more than happy to send some of our more mature chickens to that great chicken coop in the sky. Retribution. And so I've always looked at this text with an air of familiarity with it, because in this, Jesus refers to himself as a hen. And he refers to Herod as a fox. And we all know that one of the arch enemies of chickens is the gnarly little fox, who, a lot like Scott, is red. And I didn't think somebody who had red hair and kind of red skin could turn even redder. See, it's really not fair that I pick on you because I got the stage here, you know. So let's visit that text, and then we're going to skip back to the Genesis one. Jesus is talking about a political reality of his time. that those in political positions always work against the mission of the church. It matters not where you happen to be living. And Jesus rightfully identifies Herod, who represents the government, as an enemy. Someone that must be stood up against. And even though Herod is threatening his life, Jesus does not back down. Rather, he says, I will continue to do what I have done today. I will continue to do it tomorrow. And then on the third day, I will pay the price. Referring obviously to his passion. One of the things this text reminds me is that at the essence and the core of a life of following Christ is a willingness to enter into suffering, to stand on those very principles that we hold near and dear. To realize that our allegiance is not to some political power, however powerful they may be, but our allegiance is solely to Christ. And so Jesus continues with his ministry of healing, his ministry of teaching, and he will continue until he ends up exactly where he wants to be, on the cross. Where there he will stretch forth his hands and he will embrace the totality of humanity. And we will journey with him during our time of Lent. But there are a couple of things that we need to understand. And so I want to go back to the reading from Genesis. There, God makes a covenant, an agreement, a contract, irrevocable, with Abram, who later will be renamed Abraham. He'll go from Abram, father, to Abraham, father of a multitude. And things are not going Abraham's way. In fact, Abraham attempts to take into his own hands that which only belongs to God. He remains childless with his wife Sarah. And so he takes, as was the custom in that time, a concubine and gives birth to Ishmael. But God reminds him that Ishmael, while Ishmael will receive the same blessing, is not to be his heir. And then he takes him outside and he says, look at the heavens. Count the stars if you are able. So many shall your descendants be. And then they entered into the agreement, as was their custom, by sacrificing animals. And so they take some animals and they cut the animals in half, thus where we get the term cut a deal. And they cut the animals in half, they spread them apart, and then the parties of the agreement walk between them, signifying that they both agree to the covenant. However, if you read carefully, you'll notice that only God passes between the pieces. Abraham never does. Only God passes between them. You see, the covenant that God has made with us is only one way. We are not a part of it. It is solely from God to us. And as much as we may stray, and Abraham will stray, time and time and time again, God remains faithful to the covenant. In the waters of baptism, you were claimed by God, marked with the cross of Christ forever. Did you have a say in that? You don't even remember it. You didn't even know what was happening. Unless the pastor was clumsy and used ice cold water, then you knew something was happening. That's why we use warm water. It's only one way. In the waters of baptism, you were claimed by God. Run if you must, hide if you can, it makes no difference. Because it's God who made the promise. And what God asks of us in response is simply obedience. To acknowledge that God has claimed us. And to understand the futility of trying to say somehow, I have claimed God. It's but one way. And just as Jesus walked to the cross in obedience, and there gave the ultimate sacrifice for you, the covenant remains but one way. From God to us. And what God asks of us is simply to share that good news with others. To be the light, the salt, the salve. Be the words of encouragement and hope, even in the midst of immense darkness. When there looks as if to be no hope, looks to be no light. I was helping my daughter with her paper on Bonhoeffer. And when she got to the end of it, she said, "Well, I must be a Christian because I have certainly suffered." I said, "Oh, you've got no clue." But that is our calling. As Christ took the weight of the world upon his shoulders, Christ asks of us to take that same weight upon our shoulder. And in that, to be the good news for those around.